Detroit, November 2025. Snow drifted through the pre-dawn darkness like ash from a fire no one remembered starting. Garrett Ashford knelt on the 40th floor of Sterling Engine Works, his 55-year-old knees protesting against marble that cost more per square foot than he earned in a week. The mop in his calloused hands left streaks across the polished surface, erasing footprints left by people who would never learn his name. 15 years ago, I owned a garage with my name on the sign. Today, I clean the shoes of people who don't see me as human. The elevator chimed. Catherine Blackwood emerged in a storm of winter cashmere and cold precision, her platinum hair catching the fluorescent light like frosted steel. 52 years old, CEO controller of everything she surveyed. Her Louboutin heels clicked past Garrett's hunched form without hesitation, phone pressed to her ear. Voice sharp enough to draw blood. The board meeting is at 2. If Volkov pulls his funding, we lose everything. Garrett stood slowly, vertebrae crackling, and watched her disappear around the corner. Through the glass walls of her office, he could see her silhouette, pacing, hands gesturing at invisible enemies. She was terrified. He recognized the signs because he'd worn them himself for 3 years, ever since Claire died and took half his soul with her. 6 hours earlier, the alarm clock in Garrett's studio apartment had dragged him from dreams of better days. $800 a month bought him 400 square feet in Dearborn walls, the color of old teeth, a kitchenette with 2 working burners, and a bathroom where the shower head coughed rust-colored water for the first 30 seconds. On the shelf above the sink, Claire smiled at him from their wedding photo, 28 years frozen in silver frame. She'd worn her grandmother's dress, altered 3 times because they couldn't afford new. He'd rented a tuxedo that didn't fit his shoulders. The laptop on the card table showed his bank balance, $347.82. Garrett made instant coffee in the microwave, watching the cup spin behind scratched glass while his phone vibrated against the Formica counter. "Dad, can you help this week? Tuition's due and I'm short." Rosie's voice carried the weight of someone trying not to ask for help. 26 years old, working night shifts at Pittsburgh General while finishing her nursing degree. Claire's determination wrapped in his stubbornness. Garrett looked at the laptop screen again, calculating how much he could spare after rent, utilities, the bus pass that got him to Sterling 5 days a week. "Don't worry about it, I'll send 200 this afternoon." "Dad, are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, kiddo. You take care of those patients." He transferred the money before he could reconsider, watching his balance drop to $147.82. The checking account notification glowed on his phone screen for 3 seconds before disappearing. Garrett poured the scalding coffee into a chipped mug that once said, "World's Best Mechanic," before the dishwasher wore the letters away. Now it just said, "WODSBOM Nick." A description that felt increasingly accurate. Across town, Catherine Blackwood stood in her penthouse on the 50th floor of the Renaissance Center, watching Detroit wake up beneath her. The city sprawled in sodium vapor orange and LED white, a circuit board of ambition and failure. Her apartment was minimalist chrome and black leather, every surface chosen by an interior designer whose fee could have fed a family for 6 months. On the kitchen island, a La Marzocco espresso machine hissed steam through $30 beans while Catherine reviewed quarterly reports on her tablet, red pen marks bleeding across projected revenue. Nakamura Marine Engine Project 47, consecutive failures. Thermal shutdown at 11:47 in every test cycle. Nikolai Volkov threatening withdrawal of $60 investment. Edmund appeared from the kitchen alcove, 68 years old, British accent softened by 20 years in America, carrying a breakfast tray that Catherine didn't acknowledge. Poached eggs, whole grain toast, fresh fruit arranged like a still life. He set it beside her elbow and waited, hands clasped behind his back. "Ma'am, breakfast is ready." Catherine circled another failure report in red. "I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning, ma'am. I'm occupied." Edmund retreated with the tray, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she highlighted another paragraph. then stilled, forcing discipline into rebellious muscles. Weakness was permission for the world to take everything. Her father had been weak once for one fatal moment, and it killed him. She would not repeat his mistake. The bus to Sterling Engine Works took 42 minutes through morning traffic. Garrett stood near the back door holding the overhead rail, watching Detroit slide past the fogged windows. Empty storefronts, churches converted to community centers. Houses with plywood windows and dreams that died in 2008. He'd grown up 3 blocks from here back when the auto plants ran 3 shifts, and you could smell prosperity in the exhaust fumes. His father had worked the line at Ford for 35 years. Came home every night with grease under his fingernails and stories about engines that sang if you knew how to listen. Walter Ashford had suffered a massive heart attack in 1993 when Garrett was 23 away at community college. The family had told him his father died instantly, painlessly, that he hadn't suffered. Garrett wouldn't learn until much later that this was only partially true, that his father had survived that first attack and lived 2 more years while the family protected Garrett from the knowledge that would have pulled him home from school. 55 years old, same age Garrett was now. The symmetry felt like a prophecy. The bus stopped at Sterling's employee entrance. Garrett swiped his ID badge at security, nodded at the guard who'd been checking him in for 3 years without ever learning his name, and took the service elevator to the 40th floor. The maintenance cart waited in the supply closet, bucket already filled with chemical sharp cleaning solution mop heads freshly laundered. He began his route at 8:30 a.m., exactly same pattern every day. Executive offices first, then conference rooms, bathrooms, break areas, working his way down through the building floor by floor until his shift ended at 5:00 p.m. Most days Garrett was invisible. That was the deal he'd made with himself when Claire's medical bills devoured their savings and their garage and their house and finally their hope. Be invisible. Keep your head down. Cash the check. Don't make waves. Invisibility was survival in a world that had already taken everything it could from him. But today invisibility cracked. At 8:45 a.m., Garrett pushed his cart past the workshop on 40, moving slow, ears tuned to frequencies most people never noticed. Behind the glass walls, Sterling's prototype marine engine sat on its test stand, like a mechanical heart removed from its body. The Nakamura Project, $4 million of German precision and American ambition, designed to power next-generation cargo vessels through Pacific routes. 8 weeks of testing, 47 consecutive failures, every run ending at exactly 11 minutes and 47 seconds with thermal cascade and emergency shutdown. Garrett stopped. The workshop was empty this early. Engineers not due for another hour, but the engine waited in standby mode, sensors blinking green and amber. He set down his mop and pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of cooling fans and circulating fluids. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and he listened. His father's voice echoed across decades of memory. An engine has a heart, son. You listen with your ears, your mind, and your soul. Garrett's lips moved soundlessly, counting. 10, 11, 12. The pressure fluctuation was subtle, buried beneath normal operational noise, but it was there. A hesitation in the fuel rail, a stutter in the injection timing. Bar pressure calibrated in Stuttgart converted to PSI by American ECU firmware, the math rounded to 6 decimal places when 7 were needed. 0.08% error compounding across 47 interconnected subsystems like interest on a debt no one knew they owed. By 11 minutes and 47 seconds, the engine would tear itself apart from the inside. Garrett opened his eyes. From the notebook in his uniform pocket, he pulled a pencil worn down to thumb length and recorded the observation in cramped handwriting. Run 47. Bar to PSI conversion error. 0.08% cumulative. Thermal cascade at 11:47. He'd been watching this engine die for 2 weeks, standing outside the workshop every night after his shift ended, timing the failures with the second hand on his father's old watch. Every test followed the same pattern. Every shutdown happened at the same moment. Everyone who looked at the data saw random malfunction. Garrett heard the engine screaming that no one understood its language. Above him, a security camera swiveled slightly, lens focusing. Someone was watching him watch the engine. Catherine's assistant knocked on her office door at 9:00 a.m. with the nervous energy of someone delivering bad news to someone who punished bad news. 28 years old, hired 6 months ago, still believing that hard work and loyalty meant something in corporate America. Catherine didn't look up from her tablet. "Ma'am, there's a security report. The janitor has been exhibiting unusual behavior." Catherine set down the tablet. "Show me." The assistant pulled up video on the wall-mounted display. Black and white security footage, timestamp 11:47 p.m., showing Garrett Ashford standing outside the workshop. His eyes were closed. His lips were moving. His posture suggested deep concentration rather than casual observation. The assistant toggled through 14 nights of similar footage, all from the past 2 weeks, all showing the same man in the same position at the same time. Catherine zoomed the image until Garrett's face filled the screen. His expression wasn't curiosity or confusion. It was comprehension. The look of someone solving a problem no one else could see. "Bring him up here. Now." "Ma'am, he's maintenance staff. Shouldn't we go through his supervisor?" I said now. The conference room smelled like fear and expensive cologne. 15 engineers sat around the glass table, laptops open, diagnostic reports scattered across screens, 8 weeks of failure documented in charts that all said the same thing: we don't know what's wrong. At the head of the table, Catherine Blackwood stood with her hands pressed flat against tempered glass knuckles, white with pressure. Every muscle in her body radiating controlled fury that was one phone call away from breaking loose. Garrett was escorted in by security at 9:30 a.m. His uniform was clean but worn, blue coveralls with Sterling Engine Works embroidered over the heart name tag that read G. Ashford, Maintenance. He stopped just inside the doorway, aware that every eye in the room was evaluating him and finding him wanting. Catherine didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Your name?" "Garrett Ashford, ma'am." "What's your position here, Mr. Ashford?" "Maintenance staff, ma'am." Catherine pulled up the security footage on the conference room display. Garrett watched himself on screen, standing outside the workshop, lips moving in sync count. The timestamp cycled through 14 nights of identical behavior. When Catherine spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a career crushing people who challenged her authority. "Then why have you been standing outside our workshop every night like some kind of stalker? Do you realize I could terminate you for corporate espionage?" Garrett met her eyes without flinching. "I wasn't spying, ma'am. I was just listening." Declan Webb, lead engineer, Harvard MBA. 42 years of entitlement wrapped in a tailored suit, laughed without humor, listening to what? A $4 million marine engine talking to you? Garrett turned his attention to Declan. "Yes, and it's saying you're killing it." The room went silent. Catherine's expression shifted from anger to something more dangerous: interest. "Explain. Your engine was built in Stuttgart, Bosch fuel system calibrated in bar pressure. Mr. Webb's Honeywell ECU is American standard, reads PSI. Each conversion creates a 0.08% error. Small, but across 47 subsystems it compounds. By 11 minutes and 47 seconds, thermal cascade triggers emergency shutdown." Declan's face flushed red. "That's nonsense. Diagnostics show no errors in the conversion protocols." Garrett's voice remained level, conversational, the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "Because your diagnostics use the same flawed standard, Mr. Webb. You're measuring the problem with the tool that created it." Ainsley Pierce, 25 years old, MIT graduate, newest member of the engineering team, stood from her seat at the far end of the table. Her hands were shaking slightly as she addressed Garrett across the gulf of education and credibility that separated them. "Mr. Ashford, where did you study?" "My father's garage." "Detroit. I don't have a degree, Miss Pierce." Catherine looked at Garrett's hands. Scarred knuckles, calluses from decades of wrenches, and screwdrivers' fingernails permanently stained despite scrubbing. Then she looked at her own hands, manicured weekly at a salon where they served champagne with the pedicures pale and smooth except for the tremor she couldn't quite control. Two people from different worlds, both carrying weight no one else could see. The phone on the conference table buzzed. Catherine glanced at the caller ID, Nikolai Volkov. She didn't answer. The phone stopped buzzing, then immediately started again. Catherine made her decision. It felt like jumping off a cliff and hoping someone built a bridge on the way down. Fine. Declan, contact everyone. Board members, engineers, Volkov and his delegation. Tell them to be here at 2 p.m. Declan leaned forward, voice sharp with challenge. Catherine, that's not nearly enough time to coordinate. Catherine turned to Garrett, and in that moment her carefully constructed mask slipped enough for everyone in the room to see the desperation underneath. You'll fix that engine. In front of everyone. 2 hours after they arrive. Ma'am, I'm not authorized to work on the equipment. Catherine moved closer until she was standing directly in front of Garrett, close enough that he could smell her perfume, expensive and cold. When she spoke, her voice dropped to a whisper that the conference room microphone barely caught. 2 hours, Ashford. Succeed, I'll give you a new life. Shop supervisor, $120,000 a year. Health insurance, retirement. Everything you lost, but if you fail, and we both know you're going to fail, I will destroy you. Not just fire you, destroy you. I'll make sure you never work with engines again. Not here, not in Detroit, not anywhere in this country. Your name will be toxic. Your daughter in Pittsburgh with her student loans and her nursing career, I'll make one phone call and every hospital in Pennsylvania will know her father is a fraud. You will have nothing. You will be nothing. Garrett looked into Catherine Blackwood's eyes and saw not cruelty but terror. She was a woman drowning and she'd grabbed onto him as a life raft without caring if she pulled him under too. He thought about Claire in the hospice bed, hand thin as paper, voice reduced to whisper. Promise me you'll find your way back. He'd carried that promise for 3 years like a stone in his chest. Start the clock, ma'am. Catherine blinked, thrown by the quiet certainty in his response. She'd expected begging or excuses, maybe anger. Not acceptance, not challenge. Garrett returned to the maintenance closet while Catherine's assistant made frantic phone calls to board members and investors scattered across 3 time zones. He had 4 hours until showtime. The closet was 8 feet by 10 feet, industrial shelving stacked with cleaning supplies, spare parts for vacuums and floor buffers. Boxes of light bulbs and paper towels. In the back corner, hidden behind a case of toilet paper, Garrett kept a metal toolbox that had belonged to his father. He pulled it out and set it on the floor, then sat cross-legged beside it, running his hands across the scratched red paint and rust spots. Walter Ashford had carried this box to Ford every day for 35 years. Inside were tools worn smooth by decades of use. Socket wrenches, needle nose pliers, wire strippers, screwdrivers with wooden handles darkened by hand oil and time. Garrett remembered being 13 years old in 1983, watching his father work on a neighbor's Plymouth in their garage on a Sunday afternoon. Walter's hands had moved with absolute certainty, no wasted motion, each action purposeful and precise. An engine has a heart, son. You listen with your ears, your mind, and your soul. Young Garrett had placed his palm against the Plymouth's engine block, feeling the heat and vibration. I can hear it, Dad. It's struggling, like it hurts. Walter had smiled, pride lighting his weathered face. That's right. Now I'll teach you how to heal it. What Garrett had believed for years was that his father died in 1993 heart attack in that same garage, wrench in hand, so sudden he never made it to the phone. Garrett had been 23 away at community college, coming home for a funeral, where everyone told him his father hadn't suffered, that it was instant, that Walter never knew what hit him. Only later would Garrett learn this was a mercy lie, that Walter had survived the 1993 heart attack. and lived 2 more years in declining health, the family hiding the truth because Walter insisted Garrett finish his education without the guilt of abandoning a dying father. Garrett opened the toolbox. Beneath the standard equipment wrapped in an old shop rag was the notebook Walter had kept during his final years at Ford. Garrett unwrapped it carefully, pages yellowed and brittle. His father's handwriting covered every line, technical notes and sketches and observations about engines that didn't exist yet. Hybrid concepts in 1987. Variable valve timing in 1990. Direct injection optimization in 1992. Ideas that Ford had ignored because Walter Ashford didn't have an engineering degree, just 35 years of experience that meant nothing to people with credentials. Garrett closed the notebook and returned it to the toolbox. Then he went to find the parts he'd need. By noon, Sterling Engine Works was transformed into a theater. Catherine's assistant had worked miracles, calling in favors and leaning on relationships, assembling an audience of 200 people in 4 hours. The main assembly hall was arranged with rows of chairs facing the workshop window. Press cameras set up in the back, live stream already running on YouTube and LinkedIn. Catherine had approved the streaming herself, a calculated gamble. Either this would be Sterling's greatest triumph or its most public humiliation, but either way, the world would watch. At 1:45 p.m., Nikolai Volkov arrived with his delegation, 68 years old, Russian accent. Thick despite 40 years in America. Self-made billionaire who'd emigrated in 1985 with $200 and a mathematics degree from Moscow State University. He'd built his fortune in rare earth minerals and semiconductor manufacturing, diversified into clean energy, and now sat on the boards of 17 companies across 3 continents. His investment in Sterling represented less than 2% of his net worth, but Volkov treated every dollar like it was his last. He settled into the front row without greeting Catherine. Pale eyes fixed on the workshop window where the Nakamura engine waited on its test stand. His aides flanked him, 2 men and a woman, all wearing earpieces and expressions of professional skepticism. Dr. Margaret Whitmore arrived at 1:52 p.m., 58 years old. Former Boeing senior engineer, industry legend, now working as an independent consultant for investors who needed someone to separate real innovation from expensive delusion. She'd been hired by Volkov 6 months ago to evaluate Sterling's technical capabilities. Her preliminary report sat in Volkov's briefcase, 30 pages of analysis that concluded Sterling Engineering had serious management issues, but potentially salvageable technology. Margaret took a seat beside Volkov and pulled out her tablet, opening a document titled Nakamura Engine, Failure Analysis. She'd reviewed 8 weeks of test data, consulted with former colleagues in marine propulsion, and reached the same dead end as Sterling's engineering team. The failures appeared random and inexplicable. But random failures didn't repeat with mechanical precision. Something was wrong with their diagnostic approach. Board members arrived in clusters, 7 executives who collectively owned 43% of Sterling's stock and wielded enough voting power to remove Catherine from her position if they achieved consensus. They took seats in the middle rows, whispering among themselves, glancing at Catherine with expressions ranging from concern to predatory interest. A failed CEO was an opportunity for the ambitious. Engineers filled the remaining chairs, including Declan Webb and Ainsley Pierce, plus 28 others from various departments. They'd all been working on the Nakamura project in some capacity, and they all knew their jobs depended on making it work. Watching a janitor attempt what they couldn't was either salvation or insult. At 2:00 p.m. exactly, Catherine Blackwood walked to the podium at the front of the room. She wore an Armani suit that cost $8,000, hair and makeup perfect, every detail calculated to project authority and control. But her hands gripped the podium edge hard enough to whiten her knuckles, and anyone watching closely could see the tremor she couldn't suppress. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on short notice. We have an unusual situation." She paused, letting the crowd settle into uncomfortable silence. "This is Garrett Ashford. For 3 years, he's been our maintenance staff. This morning he claimed he could repair the engine our team hasn't solved in 8 weeks. I'm giving him 2 hours to prove it. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Margaret Whitmore leaned forward, studying Garrett with the intensity of someone evaluating an unexpected variable. The maintenance uniform, the weathered face, the posture that suggested hard-won competence rather than academic training. She'd met men like this before, the kind who learned engineering through hands and intuition rather than textbooks. Usually they worked in obscurity, sometimes they were brilliant. Catherine continued, voice steady despite the fear that threatened to crack through. If Mr. Ashford succeeds, he becomes technical supervisor at $120,000 per year. If he fails, he's terminated, and Sterling Engine Works will need to explain to our investors why we've wasted 8 weeks and millions of dollars. Volkov stood up without warning, his accented voice cutting through the room like a blade through silk. Excuse me, Mrs. Blackwood. If this man fails, we also move forward. My $60 million will move forward to a company that knows what it's doing. The threat was explicit and absolute. Catherine's face went pale, then flushed, then settled into rigid control. Yes, Mr. Volkov. I understand completely. She gestured toward the workshop. Mr. Ashford, you have 2 hours starting now. Garrett walked to the workshop entrance under 200 pairs of eyes, all weighing him, measuring him, finding him inadequate. The security guard at the door checked his temporary access badge, then stepped aside. Garrett entered the climate-controlled space. Sealed glass walls on 3 sides, turning the workshop into an aquarium where he was the specimen on display. The Nakamura engine dominated the room, 7 feet long and 4 feet tall. A masterpiece of German engineering wrapped in cooling systems and sensor arrays. Garrett approached it slowly, boots clicking on the epoxy-coated floor, aware that cameras were capturing his every movement for immediate broadcast to thousands of viewers online. He placed both hands on the engine block. The metal was cool, inert, waiting. Around him, 200 people in the assembly hall fell silent. The live stream chat scrolled past with comments ranging from encouragement to mockery. This is going to be embarrassing. Give the guy a chance. $50 says he doesn't last 20 minutes. I'm rooting for him, but this is insane. Garrett closed his eyes and listened. Not with his ears alone, but with the part of himself his father had trained over 15 years of Sunday afternoons in a garage that smelled like motor oil and possibility. The engine's systems hummed in standby mode, a complex symphony of pumps and servos and electronic controls. Buried beneath the surface noise, he found what he was looking for. The pressure fluctuation in fuel rail 3, the stutter in injection timing, the mathematical error that no one else could hear because they were measuring it with tools calibrated to the same flawed standard. Behind the glass, Margaret Whitmore pulled out her phone and opened the live stream, reading comments. Someone had posted technical specifications for the Bosch fuel system. Someone else linked to Honeywell's ECU documentation. A third commenter, claiming to be a marine engineer in Norway, wrote, "If there's a metric/imperial conversion issue, he's right to check the adapter protocols. But that's too simple. Sterling would have caught that." Garrett opened his eyes and addressed the microphone system that Catherine had installed for the demonstration. "Start the engine." Declan Webb, watching from the front row, exchanged glances with Ainsley Pierce. She looked hopeful. He looked like a man watching his career burn down. Declan pulled out his phone and activated the engine's remote start sequence. The Nakamura roared to life, pistons firing in sequence, fuel pumps engaging, cooling systems spinning up. The sound was glorious, powerful, exactly what a $4 million engine should sound like. Garrett kept his hands on the block, feeling vibrations travel through metal into bone. There, 2400 RPM, pressure spike in fuel rail 3 every 3.2 seconds. Declan checked his tablet, pulling up real-time diagnostics. The readings show normal operation. Garrett kept his eyes closed, voice calm and certain. Your readings are wrong. The engine speaks truth. Machines lie. Margaret Whitmore stood abruptly, startling Volkov beside her. She walked to the glass wall, pressing close enough that her breath fogged the surface. When she spoke, her voice carried authority that made even Volkov pay attention. How long until thermal cascade? Garrett looked directly at her, recognizing something in her intensity that reminded him of his father. 11 minutes 47 seconds, like the previous 47 tests. Margaret nodded slowly. Do you have a solution? Garrett pulled the worn notebook from his pocket, the one where he'd recorded 2 weeks of observations. He flipped to a page covered in pencil sketches and calculations. I need a Siemens PN7ML544RU adapter. Metric to Imperial Bridge, $58 at any industrial supplier. A board member in the third row laughed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. A $58 part fixes a $4 million problem. This is absurd. Garrett turned to face the man, voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones, sir. We overcomplicate things because we think complicated problems need complicated answers. But the engine doesn't care about complexity, it just wants to be understood. He walked to the parts cabinet and retrieved the adapter he'd ordered 3 days ago using his own credit card. A $20 delivery charge he couldn't afford but paid anyway because something in him needed to prove this was solvable. The adapter was unremarkable, brushed aluminum the size of a hockey puck designed to bridge the gap between measurement standards invented on different continents by engineers who never imagined their systems would need to talk to each other. What followed was 90 minutes of work captured in high definition from 6 camera angles. Garrett's hands moved with practiced efficiency. Installing the adapter, recalibrating sensors, adjusting fuel mapping, in the ECU firmware using diagnostic tools that Declan Webb grudgingly provided. The live stream chat devolved into technical debate among engineers worldwide, some supporting Garrett's approach, others insisting it was too simple to work, all of them watching because the story had captured something primal. The underdog versus the system, knowledge versus credentials, intuition versus institutional authority. Ainsley Pierce approached the glass wall, tablet in hand, following Garrett's modifications in the diagnostic readouts. Each change he made rippled through the system logs, parameters, shifting into new configurations. She pulled up the conversion protocols and saw it immediately: 0.08% error in the bar to PSI calculation, exactly as Garrett had described, multiplied across 47 subsystems, compounding over 11 minutes and 47 seconds until the accumulated error triggered safety shutdowns. She turned to Declan, who was pretending not to watch her screen. He's right. The conversion error is documented in the Honeywell spec sheet buried in Appendix F. We never checked it because we assumed American and German engineers would account for cross-platform compatibility. Declan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He'd spent 8 weeks failing to solve this problem. His pride was worth less than keeping his job. At 3:47 p.m., 13 minutes ahead of schedule, Garrett stepped back from the engine and wiped his hands on the rag from his father's toolbox. The fabric was stained beyond redemption, but he'd never throw it away. Some things mattered more than cleanliness. Ready for testing. Declan activated the restart sequence remotely. The engine had been running for the past 90 minutes, but Garrett had worked on it while operational, making live adjustments, like a surgeon operating on a beating heart. Now they would see if the patient survived. The clock on the wall read 3:48 p.m. The assembly hall held 200 people in absolute silence. The live stream had 17,000 viewers, chat scrolling too fast to read. Garrett stood beside the engine, one hand resting on the block, feeling the steady rhythm of combustion and pressure, and heat converted into rotational energy. 4 minutes passed, 5 minutes, 8 minutes. At 3:58 p.m., 10 minutes into the test, people began shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. The sound echoed like a gunshot. At 3:59 p.m., 11 minutes, the moment of truth approached. Every previous test had ended at 11 minutes 47 seconds with thermal cascade and emergency shutdown. Catherine Blackwood gripped the armrests of her chair hard enough to hurt Knuckles' white, breathing shallow. Volkov leaned forward, expressionless. Margaret Whitmore held her tablet in both hands, watching the temperature graphs climb toward the critical threshold. 11 minutes, 30 seconds. 11 minutes, 40 seconds. 11 minutes, 47 seconds. The engine continued running. Temperature stable. Pressure optimal. No errors logged. Ainsley Pierce gasped, hand covering her mouth. Declan Webb stared at his diagnostic screen like it was a magic trick he couldn't explain. 12 minutes. 13 minutes. 14 minutes. Someone in the back row started clapping. The sound was tentative at first, unsure, then grew as others joined. 15 minutes. The applause built into a wave. 16 minutes. People stood. 17 minutes. The assembly hall erupted in cheers. Dr. Margaret Whitmore was the first to approach the glass, her movement drawing Volkov's attention. She pressed her hand against the surface, watching Garrett through the transparent barrier. When she spoke, her voice carried through the microphone system with crystalline clarity. "Where did you study, Mr. Ashford?" Garrett met her eyes, seeing something in them that reminded him of Walter of Sunday afternoons. Learning to listen to engines that spoke in frequencies most people never heard. "My father's garage. Detroit. I don't have a degree, ma'am." Margaret nodded slowly, a gesture of recognition and respect. "Your solution was elegant. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually correct." Volkov stood and walked to the glass beside Margaret. His pale eyes studied Garrett with the intensity of someone reevaluating a fundamental assumption. When he spoke, his Russian accent made the words sound formal and weighted. "Mr. Ashford, you have saved my investment. I am grateful." He began to clap, slow and deliberate. The sound cut through the celebrating crowd like a conductor calling an orchestra to attention. Others joined him until the entire room applauded in synchronization, 200 people acknowledging something they didn't entirely understand, but couldn't deny. Garrett didn't celebrate. He remained beside the engine, hand resting on the warm metal, feeling the heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. Through the glass, he could see Catherine Blackwood standing alone near the podium, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face mask, shattered by relief and humiliation and something that might have been gratitude. She approached the glass slowly, every eye following her movement. The applause faded into silence again, waiting to see how the CEO would handle this moment of complete vulnerability in front of investors and employees and 17,000 strangers watching online. "You saved my company." Garrett's voice was gentle, without triumph or mockery. "I fixed an engine, ma'am. Saving the company is your job." Catherine extended her hand, palm pressed against the glass barrier between them. Garrett matched the gesture from his side. Two hands separated by transparent inches, symbols of different worlds touching without touching. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford." The image was captured by 6 cameras and would be shared 10,000 times by midnight, the CEO and the janitor hands meeting through glass. One of them crying, both of them changed by the past 2 hours in ways neither could yet articulate. At 11:47 p.m., Garrett's phone rang in his dark apartment. He'd been lying on his bed, still in his uniform, too tired to change or eat, staring at the ceiling while his body processed 3 years of invisibility finally ending. The caller ID showed unknown number. He answered anyway. "Hello," Catherine Blackwood's voice came through, cold and precise, the vulnerability from earlier completely erased. "Don't celebrate yet, Ashford." Garrett sat up, turning on the bedside lamp. Outside his window, snow fell harder now, accumulating on the sill. "I've done my research. Bankruptcy filing 2022. Ashford Auto Repair. 580,000 in medical debt. Your wife. Cancer. That's none of your business. Everything about the man who humiliated me is my business. I also found customer complaints. Safety violations. A lawsuit settled out of court in 2008. The lawsuit was fraudulent. The customer claimed I'd installed faulty brakes, but inspection proved the failure was from wear, not workmanship. We settled because fighting it would have cost more than paying it. I don't care what it was, Ashford. I care what it looks like. Disgraced mechanic tricks investors. I can see the headlines already. Garrett's hand tightened on the phone, anger rising for the first time since Claire died, genuine fury at someone trying to take from him again, when he had so little left to lose. What do you want? Resign tomorrow morning. Write a letter saying you got lucky, return to maintenance. Do that, I'll let you keep your janitor job. And if I refuse, Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper, quieter and therefore more menacing than any shout could be. Then I don't just fire you, I destroy you. Dead wife, failed business, your daughter Rosalind in Pittsburgh, nursing school, $40,000 in student loans. How would her future employers react if they knew her father was a fraud? One phone call, Ashford. One conversation with the right person and her career is dead before it starts. Silence filled the space between them, broken only by the faint sound of traffic on Catherine's end and the heater clicking on in Garrett's apartment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled rage. Don't you dare mention my daughter. Catherine paused, and for a moment the mask slipped enough that Garrett could hear something other than cruelty. Pain, maybe, or recognition of herself in his anger. What kind of person are you? The kind who survives, Ashford. You don't understand. You never will. The line went dead. Garrett sat in the lamplight, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to silence. On his nightstand, Claire smiled at him from their wedding photo 28 years ago, back when they'd believed love and hard work were enough to build a life that couldn't be taken away. He'd promised her he'd find his way back. Today he'd taken the first step, and now Catherine Blackwood was threatening to push him off the cliff before he could take the second. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Ashford, this is Dr. Margaret Whitmore. We need to talk tonight about Catherine Blackwood. Garrett stared at the message, then at Claire's photo, then out the window at the snow falling on Detroit. He texted back, where and when. The response was immediate. My hotel now, the Renaissance Center. Room 4012. The Renaissance Center rose 40 floors above the Detroit river glass and steel-catching city lights, like a monument to ambition that survived the city's collapse and resurrection. Garrett arrived at 12:30 a.m., snow melting off his jacket and the lobby's heated air security guard barely glancing at him before waving him toward the elevators. Room 4012 occupied the 40th floor northwest corner view of Windsor across the dark water. Dr. Margaret Whitmore answered on the first knock, still dressed despite the hour-gray hair, pulled back reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She stepped aside without greeting, gesturing Garrett into a suite that cost more per night than his monthly rent. Coffee, please. Margaret moved to a French press on the desk, pouring 2 cups with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades in labs and workshops where coffee was fuel rather than pleasure. She handed Garrett a mug, ceramic warm against his cold hands, then settled into the chair by the window. Garrett took the sofa, sinking into cushions that probably cost more than his car. Tell me about Catherine's call. Garrett recounted the conversation, Catherine's threats against Rosie, the demand for resignation, the promise of destruction if he refused. Margaret listened without interrupting, fingers steepled under her chin, processing information the way engineers process data, systematically looking for patterns and failure points. She's panicking. She threatened my daughter. No, she's showing you where you're vulnerable. It's tactical, not personal. Catherine doesn't attack strength. She attacks love. That's how terrified people operate. Garrett drank the coffee, bitter and strong, grounding him in the present moment. Outside the window, Detroit sprawled in orange sodium light and LED white, a city that had died and refused to stay buried. How do you know so much about her? Because 30 years ago I was her. Margaret set down her cup and stood walking to the window, back to Garrett's silhouette against the city. 1995. I was 28, Boeing's youngest senior engineer. I climbed over anyone who got in my way. No friends, no family, just work and ambition. Then there was an accident. Alaska Airlines Flight 261. Stabilizer jack screw failure. 88 people died because I missed a detail during final review. One calculation error. 0.03 millimeters of tolerance I didn't account for. Garrett remembered the crash, the investigation, the lawsuits that lasted years. The news said it was maintenance failure. That's what Boeing's lawyers argued successfully. But I knew. The engineering team knew. We'd signed off on a design that had a critical flaw, and we buried it in paperwork because admitting it would have cost billions. I was fired quietly, blacklisted from aerospace, lost everything I'd built. For 2 years, I couldn't find work anywhere in the industry. Then what happened? Margaret turned from the window, and in the dim light, Garrett saw pain that time hadn't erased. A Ford engineer in Detroit heard about me, reached out, offered to teach me to rebuild engines in his garage, said I still had value even if I'd made mistakes, said failure doesn't define people. How they respond to it does. Garrett's chest tightened, understanding arriving like thunder after lightning. My father, Walter Ashford. Margaret pulled an old photograph from her tablet case, edges worn from handling. The image showed a younger version of herself standing beside Walter in a garage, both covered in grease, both smiling. The timestamp read June 1995. Your father saved my life, Garrett, not with money or connections, with kindness. He taught me that talent isn't about credentials, it's about character, about listening, about caring enough to fix what's broken, including people. She handed him the photograph. Garrett held it carefully, seeing his father's face frozen in a moment of generosity he'd never mentioned. Wait, I always believed Dad died in '93. Heart attack in his garage. Margaret shook her head gently. He had a heart attack in '93, nearly died. But paramedics revived him. He spent 2 months in cardiac rehab, then went back to Ford for another 2 years. He finally passed in '95. I was there for the funeral. Garrett's world tilted sideways. Every memory he'd built around his father's death was off by 2 years. The timeline he'd carried for 3 decades had a hole in it shaped like information no one had shared. Why didn't anyone tell me? Margaret's voice was careful, navigating family history that wasn't hers to judge. Your father asked them not to. He didn't want you leaving college to take care of him. He made the family promise they'd tell you it was sudden, painless, that he didn't suffer. Walter wanted you to have your own life, not sacrifice it for his illness. The coffee mug trembled in Garrett's hands. He set it down before it spilled. He was protecting me, even when it cost him your presence at the end. That's the kind of man your father was. Silence filled the hotel room, broken only by the heating system cycling on and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Garrett looked at the photograph again, his father alive, 2 years longer than he'd known. Teaching someone else the skills Garrett had learned in childhood, passing on knowledge like a relay race where the torch never went out. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand Catherine Blackwood. She's not evil, Garrett. She's broken. And broken people hurt others to protect themselves from being hurt again. Margaret returned to her chair and opened her tablet, pulling up a file folder that expanded into dozens of documents, financial records, news articles, police reports, psychiatric evaluations. Catherine Blackwood, born 1973, Detroit. Father was Robert Blackwood, founded Blackwood Manufacturing in 1965. Built it into a $50 million company over 25 years. Then in 1989, his business partners embezzled $4 million and framed him for it. Robert faced 15 years in federal prison. She pulled up a newspaper clipping, headline screaming across the top, Blackwood Manufacturing CEO found dead, apparent suicide. Catherine was 16. She found him in his office. He'd hanged himself from the sprinkler pipe. Left a note saying he couldn't face prison, couldn't watch his family lose everything because of his weakness. Garrett studied the photograph beneath the headline, Robert Blackwood in Better Days. Standing in front of his factory, arm around a teenage girl who looked like a younger version of Catherine. Same platinum hair, same sharp features, same eyes that suggested she'd already learned the world was crueler than fairy tales promised. What happened to the family? Margaret swiped to another document, bankruptcy filing. Catherine's mother lost the house, the cars, their savings. Everything was seized to pay debts and legal fees. Catherine dropped out of high school, worked 3 jobs to support her mother and younger brother. 16 years old, doing night shifts at a diner, weekend shifts at a factory, morning shifts at a dry cleaner. 10 years later, she'd saved enough to start Sterling Engine Works in her father's name. Built it from nothing into a $400 million company over another 15 years. Success story, survival story. There's a difference. Margaret brought up another document, this one marked confidential, board eyes only. Financial statements from Sterling's internal audits showing discrepancies between reported performance and actual results. Projects claimed as successful that had failed. Revenue projections inflated by 20 to 30%. Safety issues buried in amended reports that sanitized problems into acceptable risks. Catherine's been falsifying reports for 4 years. Hiding failures. Inflating successes. Total fraud exposure is somewhere around $180 million. Garrett processed this information, puzzle pieces clicking into place. She's terrified of losing the company, of becoming her father. Exactly. Robert Blackwood was weak, once trusted the wrong people, and it killed him. Catherine swore she'd never be vulnerable like that. Never trust anyone, never show weakness. But fear-based control isn't leadership. It's a prison that eventually collapses. So what do we do? Margaret closed the tablet and met Garrett's eyes with the directness of someone who'd spent a career making difficult decisions. We offer her a choice. Cooperate fully with an investigation, resign as CEO, testify against anyone complicit in the fraud. In exchange, no criminal prosecution. She steps down, assists the cleanup, and Sterling survives under new leadership. Why would she accept that? She threatened to destroy me tonight, because right now she's operating from panic. Tomorrow morning, when she's had time to think, she'll realize she has 2 paths: continue the fraud and eventually go to prison like her father almost did, or confess and get a second chance he never had. And if she chooses prison, then we give the evidence to federal prosecutors, and she makes that choice anyway. Just without the benefit of cooperation. But I don't think she will. Catherine's not stupid, she's scared. Garrett picked up the photograph of Walter and Margaret again. Studying his father's face, the smile that said, helping someone mattered more than being recognized for it. Why are you helping me? You don't owe me anything. I owe your father everything. He taught me that redemption is possible if someone's brave enough to offer it. Now it's my turn to pass that forward. They spent the next 2 hours building a case. Margaret had been collecting evidence for Volkov's due diligence investigation, documentation that Sterling's reported performance didn't match observable reality. Project timelines that claimed success while internal memos documented failure. Revenue recognition that booked future sales as current income. Safety certifications rushed through approval despite unresolved concerns. The Nakamura engine was just the most visible problem. Beneath it lay a pattern of institutional dishonesty that started small and metastasized until the entire company operated on performance theater rather than engineering reality. Garrett contributed his own observations from 3 years of invisibility. Conversations overheard while mopping floors, documents glimpsed while emptying trash cans. The small corruptions that seemed insignificant individually, but accumulated into systemic failure. He'd never thought to connect them before because he was just the janitor, not part of the machinery. Now he understood that janitors saw everything precisely because no one worried about what they witnessed. By 2:30 a.m. they had a plan. Margaret would approach Catherine in the morning with evidence and an offer. Garrett would be present as witness and paradoxically as proof that change was possible. The man Catherine had tried to destroy yesterday had saved her company. Maybe that same man could save her from herself. One more thing. Margaret pulled out another folder. This one physical paper rather than digital. The weight of documentation that couldn't be deleted or hacked. These are your father's notebooks from his last 2 years at Ford. He left them with me before he died, asked me to give them to you when you were ready. I didn't think you were ready until tonight. She handed Garrett a stack of engineering notebooks, 12 volumes bound in black canvas, Walter Ashford's name printed on each spine in silver marker. Garrett opened the first one, seeing his father's handwriting. Technical sketches, solutions to problems that wouldn't exist for another decade. Hybrid engine concepts, 1987. Variable valve timing, 1990. Direct injection optimization, 1992. Walter had been inventing the future in a garage while Ford executives ignored him because he lacked the right credentials. The last notebook contained a letter on the final page dated June 10, 1995, 2 weeks before Walter died. Garrett, if you're reading this, I'm gone and Margaret has decided you're ready. I'm sorry I wasn't there longer, but I'm leaving you something more valuable than money or property, the ability to hear what others can't. The world doesn't recognize people like us. No degrees, no fancy schools, but engines don't care about that. They speak truth to anyone who listens. Listen, son. Fix what's broken, including people. Make me proud. Love, Dad. Garrett's eyes blurred with tears he'd held back for 32 years. Grief for the father who'd died protecting him, pride for the legacy that had shaped him without his knowing. Margaret waited in respectful silence while he composed himself, understanding that some moments required space rather than comfort. Thank you for keeping these safe. Your father trusted me with his life's work. I'm glad to finally complete that trust. What time are we meeting, Catherine? 8 a.m. Her office. I'll text her at 6 to arrange it. She won't refuse because she'll want to control the location. And if she brings lawyers? Then we know she's chosen the hard path, but I don't think she will. Catherine's smart enough to recognize when she's out of options. Catherine Blackwood sat behind her desk like a queen awaiting execution, spine, straight, hands folded. Makeup perfect despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. She'd dressed in a black suit that looked like mourning clothes, hair pulled back severely, every detail calculated to project control she no longer possessed. The office was immaculate as always. Minimalist and cold, but Garrett noticed what he'd missed before a single photograph on the credenza behind her desk, teenage Catherine standing beside her father in front of Blackwood Manufacturing, both smiling like they believed the future was theirs to build. Dr. Whitmore, Mr. Ashford, I assume this isn't a social call. Margaret set her briefcase on the desk and opened it, removing a tablet and a folder thick with documentation. We're here to discuss your options, Catherine. You have 2 paths forward. I'd like to explain both before you choose. Catherine's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly, knuckles pressing white against the dark wood of the desk. I'm listening. Margaret activated her tablet and turned it so Catherine could see the screen. Financial statements, internal memos, project reports, all annotated with highlights and margin notes that traced the pattern of falsification across 4 years. You've been systematically misrepresenting Sterling's performance since 2021, hiding failures, inflating successes, booking future revenue as current income, rushing safety certifications. The total fraud exposure is approximately $180 million across 14 major contracts. Catherine's face went pale, but her voice remained steady, a woman who'd learned to lie convincingly because survival depended on it. Those are internal documents. You had no authorization to access them. I'm Volkov's technical consultant. He authorized me to review anything necessary for due diligence. What I found was a company built on performance theater rather than engineering reality. The Nakamura engine wasn't an isolated failure. It was a symptom of institutional dishonesty that starts with you. Catherine stood abruptly, circling around the desk, caged animal energy seeking an exit that didn't exist. You don't understand. You've never run a company, never dealt with board members who demand impossible results or investors who threaten to pull funding at the first sign of trouble. I did what I had to do to survive. Garrett spoke for the first time, voice quiet but carrying weight that made Catherine stop pacing. Your father survived his business partner's betrayal until he decided he couldn't. You've been terrified of becoming him your entire adult life. But Catherine, you already have. You're just dying slower. Catherine's mask shattered. Tears came suddenly, overwhelming defenses that had held for decades. She sank into her chair, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like they'd been locked in a vault and finally broke free. I don't know how to stop. I started with one small adjustment to one report, then another. Then I couldn't stop because admitting I'd lied would mean losing everything. The board would fire me, investors would sue. My father's company would collapse like his did. I'd be him, weak, dead, forgotten. Margaret's voice softened, losing its prosecutorial edge, becoming something closer to compassion. Your father wasn't weak, Catherine. He was betrayed by people he trusted. That's not weakness, that's tragedy, and you're not him. You built Sterling from nothing. That took courage and skill and determination. The fraud doesn't erase that. It just means you made choices out of fear instead of strength. What happens now? Prison. Margaret pulled a document from her folder and set it in front of Catherine. That depends on you. Path 1, we give this evidence to federal prosecutors. You're indicted for securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction. You spend the next 3 years fighting charges that you'll probably lose. Sterling collapses during the investigation. Your father's legacy dies along with your freedom. Catherine stared at the document like it was a bomb waiting to detonate. Path 2. Margaret placed a second document beside the first. You cooperate fully. Confess everything to the board this morning. Resign as CEO immediately. Provide testimony against any suppliers or contractors who participated in the fraud. In exchange, no criminal prosecution. You step down, assist the investigation, and Sterling survives under new leadership. You lose your position but keep your freedom and get a chance to rebuild who you are. Why would you offer that? After everything I've done, after I threatened Mr. Ashford's daughter last night, why give me an exit? Garrett answered before Margaret could, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years mourning a woman who'd believed people deserved second chances. Because my wife taught me that mistakes don't define people. How they respond to mistakes does. You can spend the rest of your life running from your father's shadow, or you can face it and discover you're stronger than he was. But that only works if you choose it. Catherine picked up the cooperation agreement, reading through clauses that detailed her confession resignation testimony. Her hands shook slightly, making the paper tremble. If I sign this, I lose everything I've built. No, you lose a position you were destroying yourself to keep, but you gain something more valuable, the chance to become someone you're not ashamed to be. Silence filled the office. Outside the window, Detroit was waking up, traffic building on the streets below, people heading to jobs and lives and futures they thought they controlled. Catherine looked at the photograph of her father, then at the cooperation agreement, then at Garrett and Margaret, waiting for a decision that would define the rest of her life. She picked up a pen. The board meeting began at 9:00 a.m. in Sterling's main conference room. 7 board members sat around the table, plus Volkov and his delegation, Margaret representing technical oversight, Garrett present as witness to everything that followed. Catherine stood at the head of the table in the same position she'd commanded from for 15 years. But her posture was different now. Not defeated exactly, more like someone who'd been carrying impossible weight and finally set it down. I called this emergency meeting to make an announcement. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO of Sterling Engine Works. The board erupted in shocked murmurs. Volkov leaned forward, pale eyes fixed on Catherine with the intensity of someone who'd invested $60 million and wanted to understand why that investment was now in question. Catherine raised her hand for silence. I'm resigning because I've been falsifying company reports for 4 years. Hiding project failures. Inflating revenue projections, misrepresenting safety certifications. The total fraud exposure is approximately $180 million. The murmurs became shouts. Board members grabbed phones, probably calling lawyers. Catherine waited until the initial shock subsided, then continued with the same steady voice she'd used to lie for years, now repurposed for truth. Dr. Whitmore has compiled complete documentation of the fraud. I'm cooperating fully with her investigation. I've agreed to testify against anyone complicit. In exchange, federal prosecutors won't pursue criminal charges. Sterling can survive this if we act transparently and commit to fundamental change. One board member, Thomas Brennan, silver-haired and furious, stood up and pointed at Catherine like she was a war criminal. You've destroyed this company, destroyed shareholder value, destroyed our reputations. You should be in prison. Perhaps, but prison doesn't help Sterling survive. Cooperation does. Dr. Whitmore will explain the restructuring plan. I recommend you listen. Margaret activated the conference room display showing organizational charts and financial projections plans for unwinding the fraud and rebuilding Sterling's operations around transparency rather than deception. The engineering work at Sterling is fundamentally sound. The designs are good. The innovation is real. The problem was management, not capability. With proper leadership and honest reporting, this company can recover and thrive. Who would lead that recovery? Volkov's Russian accent made the question sound like an indictment. Everyone here knew about the fraud and did nothing, or everyone was incompetent enough not to notice. Either way, why should I trust any of you? Margaret gestured toward Garrett. Because you already saw the solution yesterday. Garrett Ashford identified and fixed a problem your $1 million team couldn't solve in 8 weeks. He did it with $58 and the willingness to listen. That's the kind of leadership Sterling needs. The board members stared at Garrett like he'd materialized from thin air, which from their perspective he basically had. Yesterday, he was the janitor who got lucky. Today, Margaret was proposing him as technical leadership for a $400 million company. Declan Webb, still lead engineer. Despite yesterday's humiliation, spoke up from his position near the back wall where he'd been observing rather than participating. With respect, Dr. Whitmore, Mr. Ashford has no management experience, no engineering degree, no credentials beyond high school and some community college. How can he possibly run a technical organization the same way he fixed your unfixable engine? By listening, by caring about truth more than ego, by having the humility to learn rather than the arrogance to assume he knows everything. Garrett felt the weight of attention shift to him, 200 pounds of expectation pressing down on shoulders that had been carrying nothing heavier than a mop for 3 years. He stood slowly, every eye in the room tracking his movement. Dr. Whitmore is correct that I lack credentials. I don't have an MBA. I never finished my engineering degree. I learned everything I know in my father's garage and in the shop I ran before medical bills forced me to sell it. But I learned something yesterday that credentials can't teach. Sterling doesn't need more people who know how to talk about engineering. It needs people who know how to do it. He pulled out his worn notebook, the one he'd been keeping for 3 years, and set it on the conference table. For 3 years I've been watching this company. Watching projects fail because communication broke down between design and implementation. Watching talented people get ignored because they didn't have the right degrees or titles. Watching executives prioritize appearance over function. I can't promise I'll be a perfect leader, but I promise I'll listen to the people doing the actual work, and I'll fix what's broken instead of hiding it. Volkov stood and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Garrett, close enough that Garrett could smell coffee on his breath and see the calculation happening behind those pale eyes. Mr. Ashford, if I invest another $20 million to keep Sterling operational during restructuring, can you deliver projects on time and on budget? I'll deliver more than that, Mr. Volkov. I'll build a culture where talent is recognized regardless of background, where problems get solved instead of buried, where we measure success by what we actually accomplish, not what we claim we accomplished. Volkov studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I vote yes. Garrett Ashford becomes Chief Technical Officer. Dr. Whitmore becomes Interim CEO for 12 months. We restructure Sterling around honesty instead of fraud. Anyone who disagrees can sell me their shares at yesterday's closing price. The vote was 6-1 in favor. Thomas Brennan, the sole dissent, his objection noted and ignored. Just like that, Garrett Ashford transformed from janitor to executive, from invisible to undeniable, from someone the system had discarded to someone the system needed to survive. Catherine approached him after the meeting adjourned, board members scattering to call lawyers and damage control consultants. She extended her hand formally, the gesture of someone acknowledging defeat without surrendering dignity. "Thank you for not destroying me when you had every reason to." Garrett shook her hand, feeling the tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. That's harder than lying, especially when you've been lying to protect yourself for so long. What will you do now?" "Learn to be someone I'm not ashamed to see in the mirror. Maybe that's enough." She left without waiting for a response, walking out of the conference room and out of Sterling Engine Works for the last time as CEO, carrying nothing except the knowledge that she'd finally made a choice her father would have been proud of if he'd lived long enough to make it himself.